Hello and welcome to this NASCAR special of Motorsport Idag podcast. On the other side, we have a very, very special guest. I want to welcome a brand new member of all the guests we've had, and it is Mr. Steve Letarte. Welcome to our podcast.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being on.
Yeah. Well, you've been quite busy. I've been watching you and Ralph Shaheen. You know, you've been in the NASCAR world for quite a long years, and there's happened so much. You know, I started watching NASCAR very late, but it's a great sport, and the whole purpose of this is sort of spreading not only sort of the word of yourself, but the NASCAR in Europe and in Sweden particularly, because we are not really a country with that heritage. But before we get into the deeps of that, what have you been up to lately?
Well, it's been busy, I as you mentioned, so I crew chiefed in the garage for a long time with drivers like Jeff Gordon and Dale Earnhardt Jr. I retired from the pit box a few years ago. I've been working with NBC Sports and our NASCAR coverage. Our coverage is the second half of the season, so the NASCAR season goes from February to November. The NBC portion is July to November. So in the first half, really, I more than anything, just make sure I'm ready when it's my turn. I go to some races. I'm a huge race fan. Of all forms of motorsports, but it's my responsibility to cover NASCAR. So I go to a handful of those races, and I just make sure I absorb as much as I can. So when it's my time, it's hard to pick up in the middle of the season because the fan, it's the middle of their year, and they don't want to hear that you're just now started. You have to pick up like you've been there all year long.
Yeah, and that's quite interesting though, because that is, at least from where I'm from, it's sort of a little bit of a unique way of broadcasting, because usually you either have one broadcasting network that sort of broadcasts the whole thing, or you don't have the whole thing, so you sort of just cover some sides. And before we sort of get into the deeper racing of it, how hard is that to keep yourself sort of updated on and sort of prepared for what's coming? How hard is that for you?
I wouldn't say it's difficult. It's more than anything, it's just you have to have required effort, which means you have to be more than a fan, because while watching racing is entertaining, you may not understand the storylines or the details. And I feel my responsibility is when it's our turn in July and they flip the cameras on and we start covering the first race, if I don't feel like I could go to the pit box and be the strategist for one of the teams or the engineer for one of the teams, then I'm letting down the viewers. They expect someone to have understood how the sport has gotten to where it is in that current year. And it is unique, as you say, but it's unique that a race season stretches that length of the calendar with that many events. While Formula One has really close to perhaps the same calendar year, the number of events are just so few and far between. To think there's really, with all of the all-star races and things, there's basically 38 NASCAR events. So that's a long, grueling schedule. So I don't think it's really possible for one broadcast partner. It'd be a lot to ask. And Fox is a great partner with NBC, and that's really the beauty of it. They have half a year, we have half a year. So kind of in the middle of the summer, Jeff Gordon and I, we get together, we make sure we have our notes cleaned up, and we kind of hand it off.
Yeah, it's like a perfect sync marriage. It's your turn. Yeah, 50-50. I like that. Well, so let's get deeper into the racing. I don't usually get emotional when I watch NASCAR, just due to the fact that I'm so sort of calm with DTM and V8 supercars. But it's just something about Jimmy Johnson's 7th championship, which is just, man, I just love it's sort of what you are so good at is the sort of expressing the feeling of what you see to the viewers, sort of the NASCAR Sprint Cup Championship, and sort of the way it's you can hear in the voice. It's not this low monotonic voice. And to get back to what I was sort of talking about, how big is it for the sport of NASCAR to have a 7-time champion?
Well, I equated it that I feel blessed to think that I have the opportunity to be in the sport when one of the greatest ever is competing. I'm sure it would be like if you could run Formula One with Ayrton Senna or Michael Schumacher. If you're in seeing greatness, and it's impressive to win a race. It's even more impressive to win a championship. But when you talk about someone who has won 7 championships, who has matched really the resume of Dale Earnhardt Sr. and Richard Petty, it's beyond imagination. And to think that he still has the opportunity to continue, I think, is even more impressive. And that's really the point. I think the number one point of last year is, every day can't be the most important day. Every race can't be the most important race. But we had this moment in Miami last year where I feel confident at 37 years old to say I would be shocked if I ever saw another driver crowned in his 7th championship. So the fact that I was fortunate enough to see it firsthand, fortunate enough to call Jimmy Johnson a teammate for many, many years, to call him a friend. He's still a very humble, genuine person. To have that much success, I think, makes it even more valuable for the sport. And I think what Jimmy Johnson has done for NASCAR is way more than just NASCAR. I think when something of that level happens, I'm a true believer that racing in general is a real big family, and whether it's Formula One or DTM or V8 supercars or NASCAR or go-karts or MotoGP, the fact of racing, whether it's 2 wheels or 4, I tell everyone it's a disease that you either have it or you don't, and if you have it, you love it, and there's nothing you can do about it.
That is true. And sort of to reflect a little bit of what you said there, I remember when Ayrton Senna sort of passed away in Imola, when Dale Sr. sort of sent out his condolences and sort of how that's what I love, because it can be different forms of racing. It's you all have your steering wheel, you have your brake, you have your gas pedal, but at the end of the day, it's sort of a very big family. And I can feel sort of when you watch sort of soccer or American football that they are of course a family, but not maybe they connect in the same way. Let's say somebody passes away on a field in soccer, you rarely hear a football player sort of go out and send condolences, although it's a tragedy. But whereas
Right.
with Dan Weldon and all the Justin Wilson, you all see all of the community of racing sort of come together and send out condolences to the families and everybody involved. So therefore, I think it's very, very special.
I think racing is a fraternity in that manner, and it's a part of the sport that ever since I was a little kid going to a Saturday night track, and a gentleman that I know was a driver there was killed. It is the part of racing that no one likes, that we all wish we could change, but we can't. We can make it safer. We'll never make it safe enough. But when you test the laws of physics, and it's truly what these drivers do week in and week out, whether it's at Spa, Daytona, Martinsville, Bristol, it doesn't matter. If you're racing, and that is something that will always be around in this sport, and it's probably the most unfortunate thing that connects us all within this sport. And I think that's why everyone makes sure to speak up, because it's something that whether we talk about it or don't talk about it, it's always there.
Yeah, for sure. And I have to say that NASCAR has really done a great job with the safety. Whether it is the Hans device, I would say more or less that it's thanks to sort of Dale Sr.'s accident that we have the Hans device. I have to ask you this to get a clarification. Is that more or less the truth behind the Hans device that it came after that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of safety initiatives that may or may not have been in the works. I don't know if the timelines can ever be completely accurate, but the fact is when Dale Sr. passed away in the way he did, with an impact that they're all serious, but it didn't take anyone's breath away. It's a type of crash we have seen hundreds and hundreds of times. So the fact that that was a fatal accident instantly changed the focus. The focus instantly went from how fast can I go around this circuit to perhaps, are we doing all we could do? And I think the honest answer is no. And I think safer barriers, the Hans device, the cockpit in general, seat technology, and all needed to be advanced. And it's unfortunate it took that type of situation to move the ball as quick as they moved it, but it has. And I think there are tons of drivers today that are out here walking and talking and racing, and they can look back to that unfortunate day in 2001 that really truly changed the course, in my opinion, of all of motorsport, because I feel that NASCAR, such as Formula One, such as IndyCar, as a premier series and whatever the form is, it's their responsibility to set the tone for the younger generation. My son races a little dirt car, and it's my responsibility to set the tone of what safety expectations are. And I do think that day changed it all for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're really good at this. You can clearly tell you're a pro, man. Those answers, spot on.
I'm learning as I go.
Yeah, but it's cool, and it's so interesting to hear you. But it's always sort of on the agenda how you can make it safer. So that's good. Let's move on and talk about this great start of the season. It's really been cool, and I think, and I talked a little bit with Ralph Shahim about it. But I'm going to ask you the same thing. What are your opinions, your personal opinions and impressions of the newly informed stages in this season?
I think the stages are a spectacular adjustment to the NASCAR format. And the reason I feel that is 500 miles in its original form was a test of man and machine. And I think years and decades later, the machines purely weren't tested over 500 miles. Technology's gotten to the point where 500 miles were not a test. I mean, if something broke, it broke because it wasn't built right or it had a flaw. It wasn't because of the distance of the race. Same thing with drivers. As technology's gotten better, every Olympics we go to, they set world records. And that's because they're smarter with their training, smarter in the gym. Well, the same thing happens to these athletes that drive these cars. 4 hours in a race car is now very manageable. So then, as people like me have tried to ruin the sport by analyzing 500 miles and finding out the best way to lead the final lap, it has kind of robbed the fan of the door-to-door, beating and banging, hardcore racing all race. Because unlike a Formula One race, where you very rarely see a full course caution, the race continues. In NASCAR, with the cautions, these teams have found a way to really manage the race. And no one wants to see a race managed. We want to see a race raced. And I think the stages have provided that. The stages have provided incentives for the best drivers in the world to go out and try to beat each other at points throughout the event. And I think the lengths are actually really nice. They could tweak them a little bit at some of these tracks, but the concept is we're going to run 25 or 30%, 25 or 30% more, and then a nice long final stage because that guy gets the trophy and he deserves that. I think it's great, but it's not just the stages. They had to tweak everything. The point system had to go with it, the value of these playoff points to have something to carry you through the playoffs. So I think there were a lot of opportunities to miss details, and so far 6 races in, I really can't come up with many details that were missed.
No, I actually like that, and that's from being a European, with all the series we have at hand. We got so of course the WEC series, and I can continue on forever. But what from 2015, 16 to now, what I love is exactly what you're talking about. Because as with an F1 race, it can be very static. It can be like, yes, goes on like a train basically. So nothing really happens to it. And now you finally have you can play with strategy, and you see that sort of people are going harder to get those points because they sort of know that these points are going to be valuable later in the season. Whereas it sort of just goes round and round and round, and sort of it just continues on.
And that's the key. So I'm a race fan. So I loved the first Formula One race. I thought it was fascinating. I loved the chess match between Ferrari and Mercedes. I love the fact that I don't think it was by chance that Vettel put the push on at the same time they forced Mercedes to pit, and then they waited for him to caught traffic and they leapfrogged him. Like, I love that strategy. But a unique perspective that Europe has that we don't in the States is that there is a hometown or home country cheering squad, and I think that's what you see. We see it in American football. If you're from New England, you love the New England Patriots. If you're from North Carolina, you love the Charlotte Panthers or the North Carolina football team. What we see in Formula One is it's either a manufacturer, you love Ferrari, or you love Mercedes, or perhaps it's your home country and you love that driver who's a star from your country. We don't have that same identity within the States. With the majority of our drivers being American-born drivers, maybe the only exception being Daniel Suarez, that we don't have that national response to cheer. So I think that we have more casual fans, and the casual fans need 4 hours of entertainment. And I think the stages have provided that. It's been a great mix. And now in NASCAR, not only do we have stages, we have this new movement of youth. These young drivers have joined the fray, and I think that only energizes the sport even more.
Yeah, and we got to get to that now. I'm not going to take each and every one of them because, we don't have so much time. But let's sort of try to sum it up. Let's talk about Daytona, Atlanta, Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Auto Club. And, of course, don't forget Martinsville as well, of course. I nearly forgot that. So
yeah, well, you can't forget that one. That's my favorite.
You see, I'm trying to be smart here, Steve. No, I was kidding. But how would you sum up the things you've seen, and how do you think, and how would you sort of explain the impact that the stages have had on these different sort of tracks?
Well, I didn't see a huge impact on the Daytona 500. I think it's the most prestigious race of the year, and the value to win that race still outweighed anything that you could win within a stage. So I saw that race ran I will say as close to normal as we could expect. I saw a major change. Martinsville is probably the one that was affected the most. We'll get to that one the last. But there have been, just as it should be, there has been some stages that had minimal effect and other stages that have a huge effect. And the reason why I like that is that I don't feel that it's convoluted. I don't feel it's made up. I feel that the structure was put in place. And one thing racing does is it creates these great storylines, whether we know it or like it, how it gets done. It does it, and it does it continually. And I think the stages did that. At Atlanta, there were some small tweaks. At Las Vegas, I didn't see a huge difference. Phoenix, there were moments. But when you look at last week's race at Martinsville, that's the time that I saw it affect the racing the most. You look at Ricky Stenhouse moving the leader out of the way to save a lap. You look at Dale Jr., who had an issue, and then used pit strategy with the second stage to get track position back. Unfortunately, it unraveled with a speeding penalty late. But I think the stages have affected the race, but the youth behind the wheel, I think, is affecting the racing as much. I think driver etiquette is something that's never been defined. And I think these young drivers are redefining it because they are proving that they are trying to build their careers. They have no resume to fall back on. And because of that, we're seeing some very daring moves behind the wheel.
Yeah, and if we should sort of stay in America and go global at the same time, we have some kind of the same thing in Formula One as well with Max Verstappen. We got Lance Stroll, we got Antonio Giovinazzi. But if we should, this is after all mostly focused on NASCAR. And for me, it's just so cool to see, especially Kyle Larson. What a absolute superstar. Not only does he have, he has a kid, he has a wife, of course, seems to have a very good home base and sort of creates this security for him to sort of perform well on the track. And not only that, he seems to have this great mental approach and just personality. And it's so good to see them go well now.
And he's a racer. He's a racer's racer. He has a great support staff, and he drives for a racer. Chip Ganassi Racing. Chip Ganassi was a driver at one point in his career. Now he is the owner of this company that Kyle Larson drives for. And Kyle, it's just truly exhilarating to watch Kyle drive because he drives with one purpose, and that's to win the race. And he has so much raw talent. I think he's had to learn how to manage. We talked about 500 laps or 500 miles. He's had to learn how to manage that and get that to the finish. But now that he has learned how to win, I think he is going to break through multiple times. And it's exciting to watch.
Yeah. And one thing that I actually have watched NASCAR sort of more or less throughout the years, from sort of since Montoya went from Formula One to come into NASCAR. And what which is very clear, is just the surge of performance of Chip Ganassi. The team, I saw at Martinsville also ran extremely well and up front for a very long period of time. Like they didn't, if you go back a few years, they didn't do much of that in the same extent that they are doing now. And therefore it's so nice because that driver deserves to be up there because I think he is that good, simply.
And I think it's important to see that resurgence of a company because I think we get to a point where we discount the fact that we assume all the cars are the same. And that's impossible if a car goes from slow to fast. It can't be the same car. And I don't want to take anything away from what Kyle Larson and Jamie McMurray have done behind the wheel, but I think that Kyle Larson perhaps could have had a learning curve, but I feel Jamie McMurray has been very consistent with his talent behind the wheel. And so as that one car improves in its performance, you would have to relate that directly back to the equipment that the team and engineers are providing. So while it's not as visual as maybe a Formula One car with a new wing or new rear wing or a wider tire, and it's covered with the bodywork and the fascias of a NASCAR car, underneath all of that, there are still major improvements, and I think that's why you're seeing it more competitive.
Yeah, but I think that what you said right there is very important for our European listeners for sure, because that is what we hear a lot about. F1 here and this, and these cars are not. I'm gonna kill this old myth. A NASCAR car is not easy to drive. I think for any guy that sort of sits there and said, well, Sebastian Vettel is the best race car driver in the world. Yeah, well, he is, but they are so different. The cars that don't only look different from the outside, but they're so different to drive. And for someone to extract the most out of a NASCAR Cup car, you have to be at an extremely high level.
Well, and I truly believe when you get to that level, whether it's in Formula One or NASCAR, it's not just about driving. It's about driving and communicating to the engineers and preparing a better vehicle. And that I think could be sometimes the most difficult part. When you get, when you look at NASCAR, we're going to say the top 5 or 8 cars run within probably 2 to 3% of one another. And when you look at that small of margin, communication then has the key, because one major difference between NASCAR and Formula One is the approach of technology usage. Now, NASCAR has the technology to measure the metrics and understand the car, but the sport won't allow them to use that during a race. And unlike a Formula One race where all of those metrics are being measured and cars are being adjusted on the fly, that doesn't exist in NASCAR. And that's why I don't want to compare ability to press the brake, press the gas, and steer the car, because I think it's impossible to compare multiple different cars and venues. I will say that I think there's more asked out of a driver as far as communication goes when it comes to a NASCAR race. They're asked to relay more information back. Now, the Formula One cars, those drivers are doing way more than driving with all the on-the-fly adjustments. So, it's a different skill set for the different types of racing.
Exactly. And you said pretty much more or less the same thing as Ralph Shaheen, and I think it's important for us in Europe, because this old saying is never gonna end, between who's the best driver, blah blah blah. And I think, as I said, I'm gonna say it again as I did when I interviewed him. They're great, but they're great in different ways, and they have to be allowed to be great in different ways. But doesn't mean that somebody that sort of Kurt Busch is more worse than Sebastian Vettel, because you saw what happened at Race of Champions.
Right.
And at the end of the day, they beat IndyCar, they beat Jenson Button, they beat Felipe Massa, they beat a lot of, the Busch brothers. So it says a lot. So don't say much. If you don't have...
And it's a wonderful venue. I am actually a huge supporter of that Race of Champions. I think it's something that we should all support more, when drivers are willing to go out and spend their own time to go and give race fans everything we just talked about, the main debate, and they're willing to put their egos and their personalities on the table and then race one another. It's spectacular.
For sure. Maybe you should be in that race. How's that sound? Never say never, man.
No, you're right. I never say never.
But also, I think let's talk a little bit about the organizations, shall we? Which is also interesting. Penske running Ford, RCR running Chevrolets, Hendrick running Chevrolet, Stuart Haas switching from Chevrolet to Ford for this season. So with Penske, RCR, Hendrick, and Stuart Haas, what would you say about these organizations? How would you sort of describe them for the start and to where we are now in this season? Are you impressed with their progress and where they are now?
Well, I think Stuart Haas, without a doubt, to come out and win the Daytona 500 with Kurt Busch was an impressive statement with Ford. I think it's really a feather in the cap to Roush Yates Racing, who is the engine provider to the Ford cars. Much like in Formula One, you have kind of the car constructor, but you also have the engine provider. And, power is one thing, but then controllable power and tunable power and fuel efficiency is all something you think would take time, but they came out with success right away. I'm a little disappointed. I would have thought that Stuart Haas leaving Chevrolet would have opened up some opportunity within that manufacturer for more support of either Hendrick Motorsports or Chip Ganassi, and why we've seen the increase at Chip Ganassi's organizations. Hendrick Motorsports has kind of stayed flat to last year. Joe Gibbs Racing and the Toyota, I actually think, have been caught. They've lost a little bit of speed. So right now, I think the early advantage as a blanket statement would have to go to Ford. I think Stuart Haas Racing and Penske, Team Penske, are the two more successful organizations. But as we talked at the top of the show, it's 36 races. We're only 6 in, and the big trophies get paid in November. And I think everyone has learned how to manage that.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a little bit of a mistake that a lot of people do. That when you don't perform right out of the box, they start talking. But we at the end of the day, it's been the same thing with Ferrari, and when you look at Hendrick. Going back to them now, they're gonna come eventually. We know, you saw what they did with Jimmy Johnson last season. So of course we know they're capable, how good they are. So just wait and see. It's gonna be interesting to see when they come. I'm a little bit worried about where Joe Gibbs Racing is. For me, it feels like they have lost themselves a little bit somewhere. I don't know how you look at it though.
I think they have new struggles ahead. Daniel Suarez is a remarkable talent, but I think he learned he would be at the premier level very late. I think they're learning how to adapt at that level. Racing, we see it in Formula One. Going from the feeder series to the top series is not a small step. Racing on Saturday in the States is nothing like racing on Sunday in the Premier Series. I think Daniel will have a great career, but I think we have to be patient. And, I think that hurts Joe Gibbs Racing to have a rookie. They have to work within. I think we don't know what kind of expertise Carl Edwards brought to the meetings, the debriefs, how he elevated their equipment, even though it might not even be him. He might have helped the other race teams. Matt Kempis has run well but had awful luck in 3 other races. And they just haven't quite put it all together. And I think there is some concern there. And some of it, you have to ask yourself, is it really a Toyota issue? Because then you have Martin Truex Jr., who is a separate organization but also supported by Toyota. He seems to have the speed he had last year. So then you start to have to ask those questions, what's happened inside Joe Gibbs Racing?
Yeah. No, and also, as I said earlier, once again, you're making a great point, because it's, of course, it's something within, but that's something they have to sort out, because we know, as I said with Hendrik, they're gonna come eventually, but they have to sort things out, and it takes time, and that's what I love about NASCAR. It's so complex, and it's so small margins, and also what I love is that you can run well for most of the race and get beaten by in the end. And you don't see that in lots of other racing series, because usually you build a great car, and that great car is great, and that other car is half a second, 1 second off. But in NASCAR, you can be Jimmy Johnson, you're leading, and then maybe all of a sudden Jamie McMurray comes and win the race. And that is what I love about NASCAR. You never know who's going to win the race.
No, you don't. It's it's truly different. Just the type of the circuit. It's such a small, smaller venues normally, and the packs are so much closer together. And how the races are run with the yellow flags and the cautions really bunch the field back up. There's a lot of ways to lose them. I tried in my career. I think I created ways to lose races. I mean, there's just so many ways to lose a race. But I think that's what makes winning races such a celebration. Is it truly is a lot of things have to go right to end up the best that day.
For sure. I think I would put you're a little bit like Chad Knaus, aren't you? A little bit of a gut feeling, the talent.
You have to. Chad and I were teammates for a long time. We're very good friends, and one thing I love about NASCAR is it doesn't matter how much technology you have, the way the sport is designed and the way the races run, there are still a huge implement of human nature. You have to understand it. Human response can still change your success in a blink of an eye, whether it's with the pit stops or whether it's on top of the pit box with a pit strategy call. And that's what I love to watch. I love to watch the chess game played between those crew chiefs.
Yeah, and same here is the instinct and the timing they have to have is amazing. But one thing that I would like to talk about is, of course, yourself. There's a lot of things that sort of intrigues me about your background. You sort of, if I'm not mistaken, you grew up in Portland near Maine, and
Yep.
Your father used to take you to some short track racing and stuff, but you used to sort of clean floors and mow lawns and do a lot of these things. And that's before we get in deeper to yourself, that's what I love about NASCAR, because it's so humble. The beginnings is usually humble, as with me. I'm not a Michael Schumacher. Remember, my dad is super rich, or where Alonso have rich parents. You usually come from ordinary, regular people, just showing and sort of put a testament that it is possible to achieve your dreams if you just believe enough and work hard enough. And that's why I love NASCAR.
Yeah, I had great opportunity. I was hired at Hendrik Motorsports to sweep the floor as a high school kid, and they couldn't get rid of me. 10 years later, I became Jeff Gordon's crew chief. I worked throughout the system. I crew chief for Jeff Gordon, then crew chief for Dale Earnhardt Jr. So I worked for basically Rick Hendrik for 20 years, and it was a great career. I enjoyed it. There's nothing like a Sunday afternoon when you roll off with 40 cars to try to win a race. It's truly an unbelievable experience.
Yeah. So now, for not only the Swedish listeners, but also for some of the European listeners, can you tell me now, what is the most important job for a crew chief?
So I think the crew chief wears many hats. So he has to hire all the people, build the cars, organize the company, run the pit strategy, communicate with the driver. But I still think the number one job that every crew chief has to have, and he has to be great at, is he has to be able to communicate with his engineers and his driver, because really that's in the end what his job is as NASCAR has grown, the crew chief doesn't make all the setup decisions anymore. There's a team of engineers that do. And you take these drivers that are very, very talented, but their expertise may not be in communicating their issues. And a crew chief's job is to take driver speak, which might as well be a completely different language, and translate it to engineer speak, which is a completely other different language. And the crew chief that does that the best removes the emotion, removes the issue ahead of them, and truly focuses on just communicating between those two very important parts of the race team, they'll find the most success.
Yeah. So and when you this, I'm gonna sort of joke a little bit here because I think it's quite funny. When you don't communicate well, that's when you sort of end up on maybe NASCAR's Radioactive, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah, we have a show here. We love it. It's Scan All, and what we do is we listen to every driver all week long at the racetrack. And listen, if you act like a little child, we're going to show you on the TV, and it's great coverage. But what I also love about that, deep down, why we pick on their emotion, that's what makes racing wonderful, is their emotion. And the fact that they yell, scream, and carry on tells me that they care. I would much rather have that than a shrug. I want the raw emotion.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm actually going to put some shade on some other series here, because when it comes to as sports move on, it sort of starts to be more about sort of talking about the sponsors and stuff like that, and that's why I love NASCAR. Before we sort of end this interview, I'm gonna do the quick question, the top quiz. Are you ready for that? Before we wrap it up,
I'm ready. Yeah.
You look ready. So Budweiser, Busch Beer, or a nice cold Coke?
Budweiser.
Oh, all right. If you could meet 3 dead legends for one day, who would it be, and why?
Dead legends. I would have to say, man, I'm a huge baseball guy, so I would love to spend an afternoon with Babe Ruth. I am obviously a huge race fan, and I would love to spend some time with probably Bill France Sr., who created NASCAR, and see if he thought that this vision was real. And then I would probably, I think the last one would probably, I've worked with a lot of great American race car drivers. I'd like to spend an afternoon with perhaps Ayrton Senna and see what another true world race car driver has to offer.
Well, that sounds great.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. It's great. Everyone over in Europe and Sweden, tune in, watch NASCAR, because I can assure you that this guy over in the States, I'm watching Formula One.
Great, man. Thank you.
Thank you.